The first time I realized I had no money of my own was the same night I decided to leave. I stood barefoot in the kitchen at nearly midnight, the house quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator, my hands shaking as I stared at my phone screen. I refreshed my banking app again, hoping it was a glitch, hoping I'd typed the password wrong, hoping something, anything, would change. $0. Not low, not pending, 0. My chest tightened so hard I had to lean against the counter to stay upright. Just hours earlier, I had packed a bag for myself and my children while he slept, moving quietly, carefully, the way I'd learned to move in my own home. I thought I was being brave. I thought I was finally choosing freedom. What I hadn't realized was that freedom costs money, and I had none. For years, he told me handling the finances was too much stress for me. He said numbers made me anxious. He said I was lucky to have someone willing to take care of it all. And because I wanted peace, because I wanted stability for my children, I believed him. I mistook control for love. I didn't have a debit card with my name on it. I didn't know the account numbers. I didn't know the passwords. I didn't even know how much we made or how much we owed. I only knew what he allowed me to know, and that was just enough to keep me dependent. Standing there in the dark, I realized something terrifying. I couldn't leave the way I planned. I checked my credit next. My hands felt numb as I logged in, my heart pounding in my ears. The number that appeared on the screen didn't make sense at first. It was lower than I expected, much lower. Then I saw the accounts. Cards I'd never opened, loans I'd never signed for, balances I'd never agreed to, all in my name. My stomach dropped. He had been using my identity the entire time, building his life, his control, his sense of power on my credit, my silence, my trust. And he had done it so gradually, so smoothly, that I never saw it for what it was. Financial abuse. The term hadn't existed in my vocabulary until that moment, but my body recognized it instantly. The panic, the fear, the realization that leaving didn't just mean walking out the door, it meant stepping into uncertainty with children depending on me. I went to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed watching my kids sleep. Their faces were soft, peaceful, unaware that their world was about to change. I brushed my daughter's hair back gently and felt tears spill down my face. "I'm going to protect you," I whispered, "even if I have to learn everything from scratch." I didn't confront him that night. I didn't scream or demand answers. I knew better than that. I had learned over the years which version of him came out when control slipped through his fingers. So instead, I waited until morning. When he left for work, I grabbed the bag I'd packed, woke the kids, and told them we were going on a little adventure. I forced a smile I didn't feel and promised them we'd be okay. I didn't know how yet, but I believed it had to be true. The shelter intake office smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee. I filled out paperwork with trembling hands, embarrassed by how little I knew about my own finances. The woman across from me didn't judge. She just nodded, like she'd seen this story before. "How long has he controlled the money?" she asked gently. I swallowed. "I don't know. Years." She met my eyes. "That's not love." Those words cracked something open inside me. The room they assigned us was small, 2 beds, thin blankets, a lock on the door that clicked louder than it should have. But when I closed that door behind us, something unexpected happened. I felt relief. Fear, yes, exhaustion, absolutely, but also relief. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't being monitored, I wasn't being corrected, I wasn't being told what I could or couldn't do. That night, after the kids fell asleep, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, my mind racing. I had no money, no credit, no plan, but I had distance. And distance brings clarity. I thought about every time he questioned my spending on groceries, every time he laughed when I asked about savings, every time he said, "Just trust me." I had trusted him, and it had almost cost me everything. As I lay down beside my children listening to their breathing, one thought anchored itself in my chest, steady and unmovable. He controlled my finances, he controlled my access, he controlled my fear, but he would not control my future. Not anymore. I didn't know how I would rebuild. I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't know how much it would hurt. But I knew this much. I was done mistaking survival for safety, and the fight to reclaim my life had just begun. The first week in the shelter taught me how expensive ignorance can be. Every morning, I woke up before my kids, staring at the ceiling, replaying years of conversations that suddenly sounded different now. Things I had brushed off as concern, as leadership, as love. I heard them again with new ears. "Why do you need to know that? I've got it handled. You just stress yourself out." What he had really been saying was, "You don't get access." At the shelter, access was everything. Access to a caseworker, access to a phone, access to resources I didn't even know existed. My intake counselor, Ms. Alvarez, sat across from me with a yellow legal pad and asked questions I should have known the answers to. "Do you have a bank account in your name?" "No." "Do you know your credit score?" I just checked it for the first time. "Any savings?" I laughed before I could stop myself. Then I cried. She slid a tissue across the desk without flinching. "You're not stupid," she said gently. "You were controlled." That distinction mattered more than I expected. The kids adjusted faster than I did. They treated the shelter like a strange sleepover, whispering at night, asking if we could make the thin blankets into forts. Their resilience both amazed and broke me. They shouldn't have had to be this flexible. At night, when they finally slept, I pulled out the pamphlets Miss Alvarez had given me. Financial literacy, domestic abuse resources, credit repair basics. I felt like I was learning a new language at an age when I thought I should already be fluent in life. One afternoon, during a group therapy session, another woman said something that settled deep in my chest. "He didn't have to hit me to hurt me." I nodded before I realized I was crying. I started therapy the following week. At first, I talked around the truth, minimizing, softening, protecting the image of a man who no longer had power over me. My therapist let me do it until I couldn't anymore. "What happens when you imagine managing your own money?" she asked. My throat tightened. I panic. "Why?" "Because if I mess up," I said slowly, "there's no one else to fix it." She leaned forward. "That's not fear. That's responsibility, and it means you're finally free." Freedom didn't feel light at first. It felt heavy. I learned how to read my credit report line by line, my stomach turning with every unfamiliar account. I filed disputes, froze my credit, changed passwords I never knew existed. Each step felt small, but each one was mine. He started calling. At first, I didn't answer. Then the messages came. "You're overreacting. You don't know what you're doing. Come home, we'll fix it." I blocked his number. That night, my hands shook, not from fear of him, but from the unfamiliar feeling of choosing myself without permission. Ms. Alvarez helped me apply for transitional housing. It wasn't guaranteed, nothing was, but for the first time, my future depended on effort instead of obedience. I started attending budgeting workshops at the shelter. I asked questions I was embarrassed to ask. What's an emergency fund? What's a secured credit card? How do you rebuild from zero without falling apart? No one laughed because everyone there had been where I was. One evening, my daughter asked me, "Mom, are we poor now?" I knelt in front of her, choosing my words carefully. We don't have much right now, but we have enough, and we're learning how to take care of ourselves." She nodded like that made sense. Maybe it did. Late that night, after the kids were asleep, I opened my notebook and wrote something I hadn't allowed myself to believe yet. "I am capable." The words looked strange on the page, fragile, but real. For years, my confidence had been slowly drained and replaced with dependence dressed up as protection. Now, every skill I learned, every form I filled out, every boundary I set felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I wasn't healed, I wasn't stable, I wasn't safe in the way I used to define safety, but I was awake, and I was done letting anyone else decide what I could handle. Still, the hardest part was yet to come. Because rebuilding your life is one thing. Rebuilding your sense of self after being told again and again that you couldn't survive without someone else, that's a deeper fight, and I was just stepping into the ring. The first time I held my own debit card, my hands shook like I was doing something illegal. It arrived in a plain white envelope at the shelter's front desk with my name printed across the top. No shared account, no permission required, just my name, standing alone for the first time in years. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it for a long time before opening it. My kids were at school, the room quiet except for distant footsteps in the hallway. This should have felt small, almost ordinary. Instead, it felt monumental, because that little piece of plastic represented something I had been denied for a very long time: access. I activated the card with trembling fingers, half expecting something to go wrong. A denial, an error message, his voice somehow coming through the phone to tell me I was doing it wrong. But nothing happened. No punishment, no correction, no consequences, just silence. And in that silence, something inside me loosened. Therapy became the place where I learned how deeply the damage ran, not just financially, but mentally. I hadn't only been controlled, I had been conditioned. Conditioned to ask before buying, conditioned to explain every decision, conditioned to doubt my instincts. My therapist helped me name it. "You were trained to outsource your confidence," she said gently. That sentence sat with me for days. I started noticing how often I apologized when asking questions, when requesting help, when existing. I caught myself mid-sentence more than once, stopping the reflex before it fully formed. I don't need to say sorry for learning, I told myself. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when the fear crept back in, whispering that I would fail, that I'd make a mistake so big it would prove he'd been right all along, that independence was reckless and dependence was safer. Those were the nights I sat on the floor after the kids fell asleep, breathing through the panic, reminding myself that fear didn't mean danger, it meant unfamiliar territory. I attended every class the shelter offered: financial planning, emotional recovery, legal rights. Each session peeled back another layer of what I had normalized. One facilitator said something I'll never forget. Financial abuse works best when the victim believes confusion is weakness. I felt exposed. I wasn't weak. I had been kept in the dark. The shelter helped me secure transitional housing, a small apartment with peeling paint and mismatched appliances, but with something priceless: privacy. The day we moved in, my kids ran from room to room like it was a palace. "This one's mine," my son shouted, claiming the smaller bedroom with the cracked window. I laughed through tears. That night, I cooked dinner on a stove that was ours. I paid for groceries with my own card. I locked the door knowing no one could unlock it without my consent. Still, the ghosts followed me. I'd flinch when my phone buzzed, expecting his name to appear, even though I'd blocked every number. I'd double-check receipts, afraid I'd done something wrong. Years of surveillance don't disappear overnight. But something else began to grow alongside the fear. pride. I watched my kids settle into routines, homework at the table, laughter in the evenings, less tension in their shoulders, more questions, more curiosity. One night, my son looked at me and said, "You don't look scared anymore." I swallowed. "I still get scared." "But you don't act like it," he replied. That mattered. I started rebuilding my credit slowly, a secured card, one small bill, paid on time, every time. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and steadiness felt like rebellion. I stopped checking on him, stopped wondering what he thought, stopped measuring my progress against the version of me he wanted me to stay. I was busy becoming someone else, not stronger in the way movies portray strength, but wiser, more grounded, less willing to disappear for comfort. Still, there was a truth I hadn't faced yet. Reclaiming my finances was changing how I saw everything, including the past I had tried to minimize, including the red flags I had ignored, including the reality that love should never feel like erasure. And as I grew more independent, one realization became impossible to avoid. Leaving him hadn't just saved me from financial abuse, it had forced me to confront how much of myself I had given away, piece by piece, without ever being asked. The next part of this journey wouldn't be about learning systems or rebuilding credit. It would be about reclaiming my voice. And that fight was just beginning. Reclaiming my voice didn't start with confrontation. It started with silence, the kind where you finally hear yourself think. In the apartment, there was no one correcting my tone, no one hovering when I made decisions, no one questioning whether I knew what I was doing. At first, that absence felt unsettling. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to tell me I'd done something wrong. No one did. And slowly, I realized how much noise he had filled my life with. Not yelling, not chaos, but commentary. Constant, quiet commentary that made me second-guess every choice until his voice replaced my own. At therapy, we talked about control without bruises, about how abuse doesn't always leave marks you can photograph. Sometimes it leaves patterns, hesitation, self-doubt, shrinking. You learn to disappear to keep the peace, my therapist said. That sentence hurt because it was true. I had learned to make myself smaller, to speak less, to defer, to accept decisions that weren't mine because resistance felt dangerous, not physically dangerous, but emotionally costly. Every disagreement came with consequences, withdrawal, criticism, financial punishment dressed up as responsibility. The first time I said no out loud in my new life, it was over something small. A family member offered unsolicited advice about how I should be handling things, suggested maybe I should have stayed longer, tried harder, been more patient. "I'm not asking for advice," I said calmly. "I'm asking for support." The room went quiet. My heart pounded, waiting for backlash. Instead, there was confusion, maybe even respect. I realized then that my voice didn't have to be loud to be firm. The kids noticed the change too. I started involving them in age-appropriate decisions, grocery budgets, weekend plans, small choices that showed them independence wasn't chaos, it was collaboration. One evening, my daughter asked, "Why didn't you talk like this before?" I paused, choosing honesty without burden. "I didn't always believe I was allowed to," I said. She nodded slowly, absorbing more than I'd intended. That's when it hit me. My healing wasn't just mine. It was rewriting the example my children would carry into their own lives. There were setbacks, of course, moments when a bill came due and panic clawed at my chest, nights when exhaustion whispered that letting someone else handle things would be easier, safer. But easier isn't the same as better. I learned how to ask for help without surrendering control, learned the difference between support and dependency, learned that partnership should feel like standing side by side, not being managed. One afternoon, while organizing paperwork, I found an old note he'd left years ago, instructions about spending, what was reasonable, what wasn't. I read it once, then I shredded it. That small act felt ceremonial, like releasing something that had overstayed its welcome in my life. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. Done justifying, done explaining, done shrinking. I didn't need him to understand my choices for them to be valid. And as my voice grew steadier, something else began to change. My fear started losing its authority, because fear thrives on silence, and I was learning how to speak. Still, there was one voice I hadn't confronted yet, the one that sounded suspiciously like his, living quietly in my own head. The voice that asked, "What if you fail? What if you prove him right?" Facing that voice would be the hardest part, and I was getting closer to that moment every day. The voice in my head didn't sound cruel. That's what made it dangerous. It sounded reasonable, familiar, calm in the way authority often is when it's been obeyed for too long. What if you mess this up? What if you can't keep up? What if he was right about you? I heard it when I balanced my checkbook, when I hesitated before paying a bill, when I considered applying for a better job and almost talked myself out of it. That voice had his tone, but it lived in my mouth now. Therapy helped me understand that too. Abuse doesn't end when you leave, my therapist said. It ends when the voice loses credibility. So we worked on challenging it, not arguing, not suppressing, questioning. Is this fear based on fact or history? Is this doubt protecting me or limiting me? Whose standard am I trying to meet right now? The answers were uncomfortable, but they were freeing. One afternoon, I made a mistake. A small one, but big enough to trigger panic. I miscalculated a utility payment and overdrafted my account by $37. When I saw the notification, my heart dropped straight into my stomach. "This is it," the voice said. "You can't handle this." I sat on the couch, breathing hard, my hands shaking the way they used to when he'd question a purchase. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. Then something new happened. I fixed it. I called the bank. I explained. I transferred funds. The overdraft was reversed. No lecture, no punishment, no silent treatment. The crisis ended in less than 20 minutes. I laughed afterward, not because it was funny, but because it was revealing. This was what mistakes looked like outside of control. They were solvable. That night, I told my kids what had happened in simple terms, not to scare them, but to model reality. Grown-ups mess up sometimes, I said. What matters is fixing it. My son nodded. You fixed it fast. Yes, I had. That was the moment the voice lost some of its power. I started applying for jobs that paid more than I thought I deserved. I updated my resume with confidence I didn't fully feel yet, but was willing to practice. I went on interviews where I spoke clearly about my skills without shrinking them to sound agreeable. When I got my first offer, I cried in the parking lot. Not because of the money, because someone saw value in me without needing to control me. Work gave me structure, routine, proof that competence doesn't require permission. I paid my bills on time, built savings slowly, watched my credit score inch upward. Every number told a story he never wanted me to read. There were moments I wanted to tell him, to prove him wrong, to show him what I'd built. But I didn't, because my growth wasn't for his validation. It was for my freedom. One evening, while helping my daughter with homework, she looked up at me and said, "You don't look tired the same way anymore." I understood exactly what she meant. I was still exhausted, still learning, still healing, but I wasn't drained. There's a difference between being tired from effort and being tired from erasure. As I tucked them into bed that night, I realized something quietly powerful. The voice that once controlled me was losing its authority, and in its place, a new one was forming. My own. But reclaiming it would require one final step. Not confrontation, not forgiveness, not closure from him. It would require trusting myself fully, without a safety net, without backup, without someone else holding the reins. That leap was coming, and I could feel it. Right there, in my chest. Trusting myself fully didn't happen all at once. It happened in moments so small they almost slipped past me. Like the morning I woke up late, the kids scrambling for backpacks and shoes, and instead of panicking, I breathed. I adjusted. I improvised. We left the house laughing instead of tense. No one was angry. No one was blamed. Nothing fell apart. That was new. For years, every disruption had felt dangerous. Mistakes were magnified. Forgetfulness was treated like incompetence. I had learned to live braced, anticipating consequences before anything even went wrong. Now I was learning something radical. Life could bend without breaking me. At work, my manager asked me to lead a small project. The old voice whispered immediately, "You're not ready. Don't draw attention. Stay safe." But another voice, quieter, steadier, answered back, "You've handled harder things than this." I said yes. The project wasn't perfect. There were revisions, questions, a few awkward moments where I didn't know the answer right away, but instead of freezing, I asked. Instead of shrinking, I clarified. Instead of apologizing for existing, I showed up. When it was done, my manager thanked me, not excessively, not dramatically, just sincerely. That mattered. At home, my kids began to relax in ways I hadn't realized they hadn't been before. My son stopped asking permission to speak. My daughter slept through the night without nightmares. The air in our apartment felt lighter, like fear had finally packed its bags. One evening, while folding laundry together, my daughter asked a question I wasn't prepared for. "Why didn't Dad want you to have money?" The question was innocent, curious, not accusatory. I knelt beside her, choosing truth without weight. "He wanted to feel powerful," I said gently, "and sometimes people think power means control." She thought about that for a moment. "That doesn't sound like love." "No," I said softly, "it isn't." Saying it out loud didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It felt clean. As my financial confidence grew, so did my boundaries. I stopped oversharing my plans, stopped explaining my choices to people who hadn't earned that access. I learned that privacy is not secrecy, it's self-respect. The hardest boundary was internal. I had to stop rehearsing disaster. Every time something went well, I waited for the catch, the consequence, the punishment. That reflex had kept me alert for years, but now it was exhausting. So I practiced something new. Trust. Not blind trust in others, trust in my ability to respond. When the car made a strange noise, I didn't panic, I got it checked. When a bill increased unexpectedly, I adjusted the budget. When I felt overwhelmed, I asked for help without surrendering control. Nothing catastrophic happened. Slowly, the world stopped feeling like a test I was destined to fail. There was a moment, quiet, unremarkable, when I realized I hadn't thought about him in days, not with anger, not with fear, not even with curiosity. He had shrunk. Not because I was suppressing the past, but because the present required my attention more. One night, after the kids were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table reviewing our savings. It wasn't much, but it was real. Mine, earned without permission. I ran my fingers over the numbers and felt something unexpected. Pride. Not the loud kind, the settled kind. The kind that comes from knowing you can hold your own life in your hands and not drop it. But even with all this progress, I knew something important. Freedom isn't just about escaping control, it's about redefining love. And I was starting to realize how much my understanding of love had been shaped by fear, compliance, and survival. That realization would force me to look back, not at him, but at myself, at what I accepted, at what I normalized, at what I promised myself I would never repeat. And facing that truth would be painful, but necessary, because breaking cycles doesn't end with leaving, it continues with choosing differently every single day. And the next choice I made would test whether I was truly ready to live that truth. The next choice didn't come wrapped in danger. It came dressed as familiarity. He reached out through a number I didn't recognize, slipping past the blocks I'd put in place. The message was short, polite, almost careful. I've been thinking about everything. I just want to talk for the kids. My chest tightened, not with fear, but recognition. This was the version of him that always appeared when he felt control slipping away. Calm, reasonable. The man who spoke softly while repositioning the cage. I didn't respond right away. I sat with the message longer than I wanted to admit, letting my body tell me what my mind was still catching up to. My shoulders tensed, my breathing shallow. The old reflex to explain myself flickered. That told me everything. In therapy, we talked about this moment, the pull to return to what's known, even when what's known hurts. Trauma bonds don't break cleanly. They unravel slowly, thread by thread. I don't owe access to anyone who hasn't changed, my therapist had said. Words are cheap, patterns are proof. Still, doubt crept in. What if the kids need closure? What if refusing contact makes me the villain? What if I'm being unforgiving? I watched my children that evening as they did homework at the table, arguing lightly over whose turn it was to use the calculator. They laughed easily now, moved freely. Their nervous energy had softened into something steadier. They didn't look like children in need of closure. They looked like children in need of consistency. Later that night, I drafted a response, deleted it, drafted another, deleted that too. Every version sounded like justification, explanation, defense. And then I realized something important. Healthy boundaries don't require paragraphs. So I wrote one sentence. Please communicate through our legal agreement. I'm not available for personal conversations. I read it 3 times. My hands shook, not because it was wrong, but because it was right. I sent it. The reply came quickly. You're being dramatic. I'm just trying to be civil. There it was. The minimizing, the rewriting, the subtle attempt to make me doubt my reality. I didn't respond. That was the boundary. Not anger, not silence. Presence without access. The next day, I felt off, restless, distracted, my body buzzing with leftover adrenaline. Trauma doesn't disappear just because you do the right thing. Sometimes it protests. I went for a long walk after work, letting the movement settle me. With every step, I reminded myself, safety doesn't always feel comfortable at first. Sometimes it feels unfamiliar. That evening, my son asked casually, "Did Dad text you?" I paused, then nodded. "Yes." "Are you going to talk to him?" "No," I said calmly, "not like that." He accepted the answer without question. That hit me harder than anything else. My children trusted my judgment. I needed to trust it too. Still, something lingered, a question I hadn't fully answered yet. If love isn't control, if care isn't management, if safety doesn't require fear, then what does healthy love actually look like? I knew the answer wouldn't come from another relationship, or another person, or even another breakthrough in therapy. It would come from how I treated myself next. And that meant confronting one final truth, the one that lives underneath every abusive dynamic. The belief that I needed someone else to complete me. Letting go of him was one thing. Letting go of that belief, that was the real work. And it was waiting for me, quietly, patiently, just beyond the next decision. Letting go of the belief that I needed someone else to complete me felt more unsettling than leaving him ever did. Leaving had been an act of survival. This was an act of identity. I hadn't realized how deeply that belief had shaped my choices, how often I'd stayed quiet to keep a relationship intact, how much I'd tolerated because being chosen felt safer than standing alone. Independence wasn't just about money anymore. It was about redefining my worth without an audience. Therapy shifted after that. We stopped talking so much about what he did and started talking about why I stayed. Not in a blaming way, in an honest one. I thought being alone meant failing, I admitted one afternoon, the words heavy but true. I thought if I couldn't make it work, it meant something was wrong with me. My therapist nodded. And now? Now I'm learning that being alone can mean being intact. That word, intact, stuck with me. I started doing things simply because I wanted to. Small things at first, taking myself out for coffee, choosing furniture I liked instead of what would avoid criticism, playing music loudly while cooking dinner because silence no longer felt safer than sound. Each choice reinforced something new. I didn't need permission to exist fully. The kids noticed too. My daughter began asserting herself at school. My son spoke more confidently about his opinions. We were all unlearning the same lesson in different ways, that love should never require shrinking. One night, after the kids were asleep, I sat on the floor of the living room and thought about the years I'd lost, the financial damage, the emotional erosion, the version of myself that might have existed if I'd recognized the signs earlier. Grief came in waves, but so did compassion. I stopped asking why I hadn't left sooner and started honoring the fact that I left at all. Many women never do. Many never get the chance. Many are convinced until the end that control is care. I began sharing my story in small spaces, support groups, workshops at the shelter where I'd once stayed. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't villainize him. I focused on the patterns. Isolation, financial secrecy, punishment disguised as protection. Women nodded as I spoke. Some cried. Some looked relieved, like something they couldn't name had finally been named for them. After one session, a woman pulled me aside and whispered, "I thought it was just me." I squeezed her hand. It never is. That's when I understood something profound. My healing wasn't just personal anymore. It was connective. At home, our routine settled into something steady and predictable. Predictability, I learned, is healing when it's chosen, not enforced. We ate dinner together, did homework, planned weekends without anxiety hanging over every decision. One evening, my daughter asked, "Do you think you'll ever get married again?" I considered the question carefully. "Maybe," I said honestly, "but only if it adds to our peace, not if it costs it." She smiled. I liked that answer. So did I. The belief that I needed someone else to complete me was losing its grip, not because I was convincing myself otherwise, but because my life was proving it wrong every day. I was paying my bills, raising my children, building stability, finding joy. Whole. Still, there was one final place I needed to claim that wholeness, not in public, Not in therapy, not in conversation, but in my own reflection, because the woman I was becoming deserved to be recognized, not as a survivor, not as a cautionary tale, but as someone who had rebuilt herself with intention. And that recognition was coming. I could feel it, just one more step away. The recognition didn't arrive as applause. It arrived as peace. One quiet morning, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror while brushing my teeth. No makeup, hair pulled back, sleep still heavy in my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't critique what I saw. I recognized her. Not the woman I used to be, not the one who tiptoed around moods and money and expectations, but the woman who stood there now, steady, self-possessed, unafraid of her own presence. That was new. I used to measure myself by how well I kept things together for everyone else, how much discomfort I could absorb, how effectively I could disappear. Now I measured myself by something entirely different. Integrity. Was I being honest with myself? Was I protecting my children? Was I honoring my limits? If the answer was yes, I slept well. At work, I received my first performance review since starting the job. My manager praised my initiative, my consistency, my leadership potential, words that once would have made me uncomfortable, like I was being seen too clearly, now felt grounding. I didn't know I was allowed to want more, I told her. She smiled. You always were. I went home that day and updated my long-term goals for the first time. Not survival goals, vision goals. Savings, education, home ownership, travel. Dreams that didn't require permission. The kids felt the shift too. My son started talking about college visits. My daughter asked about starting a small business someday. Their questions were rooted in possibility, not fear. One night while tucking them in, my daughter wrapped her arms around my neck and whispered, "You're not scared like before." I kissed her forehead. I learned how to be brave. "No," she said thoughtfully, "you learned how to be safe." That stopped me cold. She was right. Safety wasn't a person. It wasn't control. It wasn't silence. It was stability, choice, trust. Later that evening, I sat alone on the couch and thought about the word survivor. People used it often when they talked about women like me, survivors of abuse, survivors of control. But that word didn't fit anymore. Survival implies something temporary, something endured. This was living. I hadn't just escaped financial abuse. I had dismantled the belief system that kept me trapped inside it. I no longer confused control with care. I no longer equated love with sacrifice. I no longer believed fear was the price of stability. I was teaching my children something different now. That love should expand you, that money should empower you, that partnership should feel like collaboration, not management. Still, there was one final thing left to do. Not a confrontation, not a declaration, not a symbolic gesture. A choice. The choice to stop defining my story by what was taken from me and start defining it by what I built. That shift was subtle, but it was final. And it was leading me into the last chapter of this journey, one where the past no longer set the tone, where freedom wasn't something I chased, it was something I lived. And in that final part, I would name it clearly, confidently, without hesitation, because my life no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to me. The choice to define my life by what I built instead of what was taken didn't erase the past. It reframed it. I started noticing how often people wanted my story to end where the pain peaked. They leaned in when I mentioned the shelter, the debt, the fear. But when I talked about budgeting spreadsheets, therapy breakthroughs, or the quiet pride of paying bills on time, their attention drifted. Pain is easier to digest than growth, but growth is where the truth lives. I stopped introducing myself through what I'd survived. I talked about what I was learning, what I was building, what mattered to me now. The shift felt subtle, but powerful, like changing the lens through which the world saw me, and more importantly, how I saw myself. At home, I rearranged the apartment one Saturday morning, not because it needed it, but because I wanted the space to reflect who we were becoming. I moved furniture, hung new curtains, let light in where I'd once preferred shadows. My daughter helped, humming to herself. My son played music while we worked. It felt ordinary, and that was the miracle. Later that week, I received paperwork from the court finalizing the financial separation. The last legal thread tying him to my life was being cut. I expected to feel relief, maybe even triumph. Instead, I felt calm. No rush of adrenaline, no urge to celebrate, just certainty. I signed the documents at my kitchen table, my name steady, my breath even. When I sealed the envelope, I didn't look back. That night, after the kids were asleep, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat quietly, listening to the hum of the apartment. I thought about the woman who once believed love meant surrender, who thought safety came from someone else holding the reins. I wanted to tell her something. You were never broken. You were constrained, and you found your way out. I also thought about the man who once controlled my finances, my access, my fear. Not with anger, not with longing, just with clarity. He no longer had a role in my story, and that was freedom. But even as I settled into that truth, I felt something else rising, a sense of responsibility, not to him, not to the past, to the future. Because now that I understood financial abuse for what it was, I couldn't unsee it. I recognized the signs in conversations, in friends' offhand comments, in women who laughed nervously when they said things like, "I don't really know how much money we have." I had been her, and I knew what came next if no one intervened. I began volunteering more intentionally, hosting small workshops, speaking plainly about control without shame, teaching basics, credit, budgeting, access without judgment. Watching women sit a little straighter as knowledge replaced confusion. One evening after a session, a young mother asked me quietly, "How did you know when it was time to leave?" I answered honestly, "When staying started costing me my sense of self." She nodded, eyes full. Driving home that night, I realized something important. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a map. But before I could fully step into that role, there was one last internal shift I needed to make, one final layer of identity to release. Because even now, even after everything, part of me still introduced myself as someone who had escaped, and I was ready to be more than that. That realization was settling in slowly, but once it fully took hold, there would be no going back. The last layer of identity didn't fall away all at once. It loosened quietly, during moments so ordinary they almost went unnoticed. Like the afternoon I caught myself planning a future decision without factoring in fear. No backup scenarios, no contingency plans shaped around loss, just a simple question. What do I want? That realization startled me. For so long, my identity had been built around reaction, responding to control, managing damage, protecting others from instability. Even after I left, part of me still introduced myself internally as the woman who escaped, the survivor, the cautionary tale. But I wasn't living in escape anymore. I was living in choice. At a workshop I facilitated one evening, a woman introduced me as someone who survived financial abuse and rebuilt her life. The room applauded softly, respectfully. I smiled and thanked her, but something inside me shifted. That wasn't wrong, it just wasn't complete. Later that night I journaled about it, the words coming slowly at first. I am not defined by what happened to me. I am defined by what I practice now. I practiced awareness. I practiced independence. I practiced peace. The kids reflected that shift in ways that humbled me. My son started managing his own small budget from his part-time job, asking questions confidently instead of anxiously. My daughter negotiated chores and allowances with logic and humor, unafraid to advocate for herself. They weren't afraid of money. They weren't afraid of speaking up. That alone told me everything. One evening, my daughter curled up beside me on the couch and asked, "Do you ever miss him?" I thought carefully before answering. I miss who I thought he was, but I don't miss how I felt. She nodded, satisfied. That clarity felt earned. As the months passed, my life filled with things that had nothing to do with survival. Friendships, interests, plans. I laughed more, real laughter, not the kind that fills silence. I slept deeper. I trusted my instincts without questioning where they came from. The old fear didn't disappear completely, but it lost its authority. It became information, not instruction. One night, standing in the kitchen after everyone had gone to bed, I realized something profound. I no longer needed my story to be witnessed to be valid. I had lived it. I had learned from it. I had moved beyond it. That was the final shift, the transition from survivor to sovereign, not ruled by fear, not governed by reaction, not shaped by someone else's control. I was the one making decisions now, about money, about love, about boundaries, about the future. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was proving anything. I was simply being. The next morning, as I walked my kids to the door, sunlight spilling across the floor, I felt a deep sense of alignment settle into my chest. This was my life, unmanaged, unmonitored, unrestricted. And there was only one thing left to do, to say it out loud, to name it clearly, to close this chapter not with anger or relief, but with certainty. That moment was coming, and when it did, it would mark the end of fear's control over my story forever. The certainty arrived on an ordinary morning. No dramatic music, no announcement, just sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor while I packed lunches and reminded the kids about homework. I caught my reflection in the microwave door, hair pulled back, eyes clear, shoulders relaxed, and I knew. Fear no longer had a vote. I had spent years believing fear was a warning system, a form of protection, but what I finally understood was this. Fear had been trained into me, conditioned, fed by control and disguised as concern. And once I stopped obeying it, it lost its authority. After the kids left for school, I sat down with my coffee and opened my journal, not to process pain, not to analyze the past, but to mark an ending. I wrote down what freedom looked like now. It looked like knowing every dollar went. It looked like asking questions without apologizing. It looked like children who slept peacefully. It looked like decisions made from clarity instead of panic. It looked like me. I thought about the woman I was when I first arrived at the shelter, shaking, ashamed, convinced she had failed because she didn't understand money she was never allowed to touch. I wished I could sit beside her now and tell her what I know. You weren't weak. You were withheld from. You weren't irresponsible. You were controlled. And you weren't broken, you were becoming. The man who once managed my finances no longer had access to anything, my accounts, my choices, my thoughts. His power ended the moment I learned how to stand on my own without asking permission. My children saw that too. They didn't see a woman who escaped. They saw a woman who rebuilt. And that mattered more than any apology I never received. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need validation. I didn't need him to understand. I had something better. Agency, stability, peace. I closed my journal and took a deep breath, feeling grounded in a way I never had before. This chapter was finished, not because the past didn't matter, but because it no longer defined the present. I was no longer surviving financial abuse. I was living in financial freedom. I was living in emotional clarity. I was living without fear. And that is the ending I chose. If you learned something new from my life story, please like this video, subscribe to join our community for more stories like mine, and comment down below where you're watching this video from. I'd truly love to know.